Thank you for such a really nice introduction. Yeah, that's amazing. You had so much information correct. And it's a great honor to speak to all of you. So I've watched the Fortunes Colloquium. I don't know how long have you been doing it for now? 3 years, 4 years?
From the start, I think. 5 years now. Yes.
Okay, so I started watching on YouTube 3 or 4 years ago. And of course, I've been watching all the amazing work in digital history that Humboldt is now becoming internationally recognized for as CEO chair. So yes, thank you so much for inviting me. So I'm going to talk to you about our digital oral history work that is ongoing. And the work that I'm going to present to you is done in what we're now calling our International Digital Oral History Lab. So I'm professor in TU Darmstadt, as Thorsten said, and also I remain an emeritus professor in UCL, and I work very closely with the colleagues there. And we do lots of projects together. So we've now bundled everything up into what we're calling our lab. And my two co-directors and my two colleagues who I work very closely with are Andreas Vlachidis and Andy Flynn. And then I want to mention all of our amazing postdocs and research associates, because basically the work couldn't happen without them on a day-to-day basis. So during the talk, I probably can't mention everybody. At times I'll make it really clear whose research I'm drawing on, but I want to, I always begin by acknowledging our research team, because this is so important. So the main argument of the paper that I want to make to you is that regarding oral history in particular, because I'm going to talk to you mostly about oral history. So my main argument is that digital methods, and especially those enabled by generative AI, they offer amazing new tools for the theory and the practice and the analysis of oral history, but they also introduce some sort of problematic, what I call epistemological tensions. And one of the tensions that I want to talk about a bit in this paper is what I call the paradox of apparent well-formedness. And so this is when an algorithmic process gives you something that's formally coherent, it's computationally valid, so it absolutely makes sense, you know, as far as it goes. But when we take our humanistic knowledge and we dig into it, then there may be issues. And so all the arguments that I'm going to make today will be like through the lens of oral history. But like what I hope is, of course, oral history is part of history. But for anybody who's not a historian, I'm also hoping that you take these thoughts and see if they make sense in your home disciplines as well. And so what I'll start trying to explore in the paper is that in response to this paradox, that we need to start thinking more and more about something that I call an epistemological standpoint analysis. So that's where we don't try to fit our disciplines to digital tools, but we reflect on what does my discipline believe in, fight for, value, try to promote in the world, and does this tool advance it or hinder it? And we'll have some examples of when this is happening and not happening. And then very roughly, the argumentation of the paper, so how I'm going to proceed is, I'm going to talk a bit about oral history, like what it is, why it's important, what it believes in. And then I'm going to talk about two of our ongoing research projects, which is about digital methods to oral history. And I'm going to pull out some of the problems that we're that we're finding in order to give you examples of this paradox. And then I'm going to briefly suggest some possible ways forward, and that's basically about this epistemological standpoint analysis. Okay, so oral histories. So what does oral history do? Basically, it preserves and it recollects some of the most important events, experiences, attitudes, and so on of the 20th and the 21st centuries. And it records recollections that carry both personal and societal weight. And these recollections are important historical sources, but they also tend to be very subjective. So in an oral history interview, what's happening is that there's an interaction between an interviewer and an interviewee in a particular time and place and space. And usually something that's important to the interviewee is recalled. It might be recalled completely differently on a different day with a different interviewer. It might not be recalled in a different interview. The information that's recalled may be very important from the perspective of recovery. So when we're trying to restore to the historical records sources that have been forgotten or excluded, it can be very important in that sense. But oral history is not necessarily positivist. Oral history is as interested in what's not said, what's not remembered, and why. So over the last 10, so this is just, I just picked some sort of examples of interesting oral history projects that are out there to already give you a bit of a sense of the type of commitments that oral history projects often have around writing diverse and democratic and human-centered histories. So over the last 10 years, I've carried out a good deal of research on the history of digital humanities, and I've used, not always, but largely an oral history approach for this. And that's resulted in so far about 50 oral history interviews with well-known and lesser-known people in digital humanities. So, for example, the female key punch operators who worked with Roberta Busa, and whose work was just kind of excluded from the oral history records. So I carried out interviews with them, and that's the book about them. But the really exciting thing now is that in the last couple of years, it's been possible to win funding to do like digital methods-driven research on these oral histories, in addition to the books that I just showed you. So this is what it's this corpus of these about 50 interviews that I'm going to talk about as the lecture progresses. So I've told you about oral history. I've told you a little bit about oral history and how it seeks to center the individual, the recollection, and so on. And I thought I could give you a little example of an oral history. So this is one that I recorded with Michael Sperber McQueen, who shortly died a short time ago. And so I don't know, so he was the editor of the XML specification, so one of the most important encoding languages in information exchange, not just digital humanities. So this is a little excerpt.
Do you have regrets that you didn't get this so-called real job, or that it?
Sometimes. My wife was appalled when she realized that as late as 10, 12 years after I got my degree, it still bothered me. She said, "You gotta let it go." And I said, "If someone loses their leg, do you expect them to forget that they ever had a left foot?" it doesn't bother me all the time, but I remember telling her at the time, this was probably the mid-90s, no, there's not a day that I don't think about it. An interesting thing happened in the early 90s, though. So it's no longer true that there's not a day that the thought crosses my mind that I would rather have had an academic job. Sometime in the early 90s, I taught a number of workshops in Tübingen together with Winfried Bader, who worked for Wilhelm Ott in the computer center there. And Winfried had been, he studied theology, he did his doctorate, he was working at the computer center while looking for a real job or something. And when his time at the computer center ended, he had this sort of time-bounded position that one sometimes ends up with. He ended up going, there were no academic jobs to be had, he ended up going to the German Bible Society where he runs their electronic publishing program. I think still does. And we were chatting together with his successor in Ott's organization while we drank coffee, and she asked how it was going. And he said, oh, you know, for a long time I was in mourning for my academic career, but I'm getting over that. And somehow that, his way of formulating it, lange Zeit habe ich der Universität nachgetrauert. It managed to click something in my mind. And I recognized that the concept of mourning was a useful way to organize that part of my psychic experience. And having identified it as mourning, it became easier to deal with. So I have had greater acceptance of the loss of that academic career.
I don't want to sort of labor this point too much.
So basically in this clip, Michael Sperber McQueen, who, as I said, he's the editor of the XML specification, right? So it's just an amazing thing in the world of information interchange. And he weeps. So his dream was to become a professor of German. And he never made it. And he cries during this interview. And he talks about how that this was like an experience of mourning and he had to let go of this dream. So for me, this was a powerful example of how oral history, so I think there in that interview, we caught things about what it means to be an academic, the personal toll that actually trying to be an academic can take on people, the thoughts about this that they'll sometimes retain years later when they've done very many other fascinating things. And so it was, for me, quite a classic example of what you can get from an oral history that you often don't get from other sources, because you're not going to get reflections like this in scholarly papers and in conference presentations and so on. So in summary then, oral history is it's not only a method, it's also a source. And for many scholars and practitioners of it, I guess it's a movement in some way. It's an intellectual, social, and ethical commitment to writing inclusive, democratic, and human-centered histories that not only seek to remember what has been maybe excluded, but also to reflect on the nature of remembering itself within the historical process. So a number of things have been mentioned. So theorists of oral history over the years have mentioned a number of things as being kind of special about oral history. They include things like subjectivity, intersubjectivity. I can't go through all of them now, but I'm going to pick out one or two as they especially relate to the projects I'm going to talk to you about. So the first is the orality of oral history. So Portelli, he asked whether what is special about oral history lies in its origin and its content. And his response to himself, I guess, was unequivocal in that it doesn't. So he says, origin and content are not sufficient to distinguish oral sources from the range of sources used by social history in general. And many theories of oral history are in fact theories of social history. His point about what makes it special is in its orality, in the fact that it's spoken. And so he really zones into speech patterns that occur during interviews that he argues have interpretive value. So, for example, he says when somebody slows down, they may be trying very hard to remember. When they slow up, they may be trying to go past a point. He says regular grammatic pauses tend to organize what is said around a referential pattern. Pauses of irregular length. This can really emphasize an emotional part of an interview, and so on. So it's a kind of a big irony of oral history that the orality is so important, but what's tended to happen is that interviews are recorded and then transcripts are made and people work with transcripts. And I did that also in my books. So in computation and the humanities, the oral histories are recordings, they are available online, but what's been published out of this book is the printed transcripts. So with so our sort of hope and our point is that with digital methods, that we should now have, in theory at least, we should have a possibility to go after the orality of the interview in a new way. So as ever more oral history collections are being digitized all over the world, more and more of this material is becoming available. And as we have, so this is the workflow of Whisper AI. So this neural network-based automated speech recognition system from Whisper. So this has the capability to a large extent to unlock many of these audio recordings. So you can take, with some languages, with actually with some languages and some registers of those languages, what's been found to be a higher level of transcription accuracy than human natively. So for very typical American, very typical, I think, English, Queen's English type pronunciation, this has an incredible level of accuracy. But what we found when we started testing with not only Whisper, other ASRs, is that actually the orality was still being omitted. So ums and ahs, pauses, false starts, instances of laughter, for all sorts of reasons that I can go into later, they're usually not actually still captured by ASR technologies. So this was the starting off point of our multimodal digital oral history work. Basically, we want to go after not only the orality of the interview, but we want to think about the different possibilities that should now exist for engaging with oral history in all of its modalities. So as a transcript, as a waveform, as metadata, as a triple, as a knowledge graph, as all of these sort of possibilities that open up within this digital context. And so we set out the kind of theoretical case for why we think this is important in this article. And then the technical work has started, and this is the implementation of the technical work is especially led by Alexei Bartholomeev. And basically what we're doing in this technical work is we want to go after laughter. So we want to detect instances of laughter that occur in oral history interviews. And we want to study them. And what we found is, unsurprisingly, that none of these, Whisper, for example, could not do this out of the box. So we want to go after Whisper because we think it provides a really compelling example of the elements, so hesitations, vocal breaks and placings, that are usually omitted from the transcript, but that may be interpretively very important. So we want to find the instances of laughter in the oral history corpus that I've recorded, and the sort of theoretical lens that we're bringing to this is this idea of scholarly persona, and epistemic vices and virtues. So I'm thinking of the work of people, especially like Herman Powell in Leiden. So these scholarly persona, these are conceptual and historical models drawn from the history of the humanities that can bring the different skills and epistemic commitments that shepherd knowledge production, or that may be antithetical to it into view. So, for example, a commitment to objectivity that tends to be valorized by schools of nationalist historical scholarship, and a possible commitment to activism or political engagement that we might see in the work of people like Zinn and White. And so these scholarly persona matter because they can help us to think about, to quote Herman Powell, how historians position themselves vis-a-vis political regimes, religious traditions, neoliberal university systems. And they show that historical studies not only requires knowledge and skills, but also makes all kinds of demands, political demands, personal demands on the people who do it. And so we think that laughter, for reasons I won't go into now, but we think that laughter may be a very interesting marker of scholarly persona. And we want to study this at scale. We can sit down and do close reading, but we want to study this at scale. So this is what Aleske has been focusing on. I won't try to do it live now again because I'll cause the same chaos. But basically what we have is he has made a workflow. So it's a mixture of Whisper 18 and the regular Whisper itself. With some Python scripts because there's issues with stylization and so on. So what we now have is it's a prototype, but it's a working environment to allow us to search oral histories in this completely new way. We can go in at the level of laughter. And now for me, now the really kind of interesting work starts. So I'm thinking like, so what will we do? We'll look at like the context around the laughter, and we'll look at who is laughing. So whether that is an interviewer, interviewee, we can think about maybe how genders is performed in these environments in relation to laughter. So I hope it's going to be, so all of this research obviously that I'm presenting you is in progress. So it felt like brilliant to get this far. You see here there's this categorization of laughter into chuckles and baby laughter and so on. That will be taken out. But now the work of actually like using this and making some meaning is starting. And we hope that this will be released to other researchers and to libraries and archives who will want to use this. So I'm starting with a kind of what I think seems so far as quite a successful example of let's say generative AI in the context of oral history. But what I want to suggest to you is that we also have to be careful to remember to approach this quite critically, and that in some ways this ASR is like a microcosm of that tells us about how we need by now a set of critical approaches to really engage with the affordances of digital methods in the light of oral history. So how can we do this? The first approach that I want to mention to you is that of digital hermeneutics or source criticism. And this is, so I'm going to quote from Andreas Fiekers and colleagues. So they describe this as the critical and self-reflective use of digital tools and technologies for the development of new research questions, the testing of analytical assumptions, and the production of sophisticated scientific interpretations. And they remind us that this kind of analysis can't be done just like at a post-processing stage at the end of the project. We need to be thinking about this all the way through, from the data cleaning to the implementation of our methods to the analysis of results. And Fiekers and his colleagues, they've suggested, their work is amazing, and they've suggested all kinds of criteria that we can use, all kinds of runways that we can use to pursue this digital hermeneutics. So for example, opening the black boxes of algorithm-driven search engines, and reflecting on the heuristics of search in online catalogues and repositories, which is brilliant if you can get your hands on that. Well, if they're proprietary systems, you're already locked out. But anyhow, but what I want to suggest to you, or what I want to sort of theorize to you, or hypothesize to you might be a better way of putting it, is that actually this ASR, this sort of generative AI turn, as seen through ASR, I think brings us into requiring maybe even a new level of digital hermeneutics. So as we've seen in our multimodal digital oral research, ASRs like Whisper, they contain assumptions about what matters. So the assumptions that they contain is that laughter doesn't matter, hesitation doesn't matter, non-standard language doesn't matter. And that's fine when we're working with interviews as a sole researcher or as a small research team. But what happens when we're scaling this up and we're dealing with huge interview collections? We're running ASRs across them. We've got no prospect of going back and checking what's happened. And again, we now know that this is a limitation of ASRs. So this is one of the things that we can watch out for, or that we can then augment in our workflow to ensure this kind of material is captured. But I think it's also very interesting to just reflect on how this unwittingly reasserts the dominance of the textual record and the dominance of the transcript. And so this is something that's been happening in oral history as a field, but now we get this continued technological impetus. But it goes further than this, of course. So one of the biggest issues, or what seems to be one of the most problematic issues that we encounter with generative AI, is this phenomenon of hallucination. So we have encountered limited hallucination, but it was so abusive that I won't repeat it. And I have, to give you an idea of so I think probably everyone here knows, so hallucination happens when, we say, AI models insert content into, in this case, transcripts that was never actually spoken. And it is so difficult because it's factually wrong, yet linguistically entirely fluent and coherent, and sometimes quite plausible. So this is what I'm calling this paradoxical informedness. It looks absolutely fine, but how and when can you establish that this was actually perhaps never spoken? So this slide, so we also, so in my, wasn't a ring for liaison, it's in my Ober seminar, I do a similar thing, actually having taken inspiration. So this, one of the colleagues, Diamensi et al., this is the presentation they gave of the kind of hallucination that they encountered with Holocaust transcripts. And it's, I mean, okay, this is like a data point of one, even less, I guess, because it's a subset section, but there's something here. And so the issue is, I see it, is that from the present computer science literature, it seems technical responses to solving hallucination we're still not there. Ways to automatically detecting hallucination, which would be very important when we're working at scale, are still not there. Given the kinds of characteristics that oral history interviews have, which of course are going to contain pauses and noises, which are actually things that are known to trigger hallucinations, it seems possible that this will be a feature of oral history corpora in particular, but we don't know because there's still not benchmarking studies. How persuasive or pervasive hallucination is, again, we don't know, because what I'm finding is individual accounts here and there that I gather up to try to keep track of. So how pervasive it is within the oral history. So there's a lot of unknowns, I think, but this is potentially really quite problematic. So, and I want to give you just two examples of how this might be problematic. So a paper that came out just last year from Quene, So they, Cohen et al. So they did it was a study and a collection of spoken data from people with a condition called aphasia, which can follow a brain injury such as a stroke. So I hate to say it, but it's a condition that could potentially affect any of us as our life over the course of our lifespan. So when people have had this kind of a brain injury, it manifests in their speech. And so what they found was that while many of Whisper's transcriptions were highly accurate, roughly 1% of audio transcriptions contained entire hallucinated phrases or sentences which did not exist in any form in the underlying audio. And then they thematically analysed the Whisper hallucinated content and found that 38% of the hallucinations included explicit harms, such as perpetuating violence, making up inaccurate associations, or implying false authority. So again, let's just imagine ASRs, so these will be used for voice to text conversion when we're dealing with chatbots, when we're dealing with virtual agents, when we're dealing with, so this is, I think this is the point when I started realizing, okay, so this is not necessarily, as I say, I've tried to make quite clear that the evidence base doesn't seem to be there yet, but this is not necessarily an issue that's limited to the oral history world. But in the oral history world, this is very problematic because of what I set out to you at the start, that oral history has this commitment to inclusion, to diversity, to representing, or to co-empowering undervoiced peoples. So the idea that people would then be sort of re-subjected to a misrepresentation is, I think, very problematic. And of course, it doesn't quite stop there. Developments in generative AI are introducing. So this is just the landing page of that was from the Ringvorlesung. So I just recommend you to go and look this. Colleagues presenting really interesting work on the state of the art of AI and oral history. So what I've been talking to you about in terms of hallucination, for example, this kind of takes us to the heart of an issue in oral history called shared authority. So shared authority is a term that was coined in about the 1990s, and it's used to sort of aspirationally acknowledge that the interviewee has the same power over this interviewer, over the interview as the interviewer. So it's a kind of a different model to your typical historical scholarship where there's thought historian and there's this trying to establish this more of a level playing ground. And then the importance of this idea of shared authority, it not only usually applies to the transcript, but also then to subsequent uses of oral histories and plays and advertising and poems and whatever kind of creative output. So aspirationally, I don't think it always happens, but aspirationally there's this idea that the interviewee retains their voice and they retain their agency in the interview and downstream of the interview. And of course, to go back then to the kind of generative AI that we've been using and the possibility for hallucination or the possibility for the insertion of content, for example, that was never there. The question is, what happens then to shared authority? What happens to the shared authority of recollection within this digital context? So if shared authority stems from a recognition of an act of co-creation leading to ownership, what authority or ownership should be attributed to the AI model that, for example, hallucinates a whole lot of content into being? And actually, when we bring in an external model in order to do something really quite significant, in this case, bring into the world a transcript of this conversation that hadn't existed otherwise, who and what owns the transcripts, the interpretations, and all of the outputs that are produced? So if we look at something like Whisper, I'm not actually sure that we can answer this question so easily. So it's released under the MIT license, which is a widely used open source license with the minimal restriction that the license be included in any code that reuses Whisper's code. So you don't have to acknowledge when you're publishing results that you've used Whisper, you don't technically have to acknowledge that you've used it. And the license explicitly states that no warranty of any kind for its use is given and no liability is accepted. And the sort of things like the model cards and the related papers reject responsibility for any harm used by this model. So, yes, so I think there's, watching time a little bit, so I think there's very interesting questions that we really need to dig into here, because from what I've said, I think not only has a kind of an aspirational ASR for oral history been brought into view, you know, so we can think about all the things that we would probably want and need to verify this content, to think about what shared authority means in this content, to think about perhaps the kinds of comparisons with different modalities that we would necessarily need to do in order to detect some of these issues. But I guess the wider point that I'm trying to make is that I think it hasn't, and this hasn't always been the tendency. So I was at a meeting not so long ago, and there it was recommended that that for people who want to use Whisper to transcribe their oral history collections, that they should go through it and delete the silences before they apply Whisper. So silences are something that can be very important within, as we've now gone through. So this is a kind of it forces us to ask really tough questions about the extent to which we bend our humanistic knowledge and requirements to the demands of digital tools, or the extent to which we take actually any kind of epistemologically grounded standpoint and say shared authority is actually something that's quite central to this discipline. The paradox of this tool is that it will do something that's kind of amazing. It will give me access to these oral history collections. It will give me the ability to run top of modern text analysis, all these things that we want to do. And maybe there will be the teensiest bit of hallucination in there that I can detect and solve. But still, you know, what, from an epistemological perspective, what are the issues that that we need to think about more? So in our next project, I'm going to move on now to our second project, which is called Mixed Methods Digital Oral History. And basically what we're doing is we're taking semantic web technologies and NLP, AI technologies in order to model oral histories as knowledge graphs. And we're doing that because we hope that this will allow us to better understand processes of basically change, disruption, transformation that may have taken place across the wider digital humanities as recalled in oral histories, and that's an important point. So what our colleague Julianne Nyhan is doing, so he's basically working to devise automated ways to extract triples from the files. And we're going after triples because of how they pull out like relationships and properties in the data. And so the work is so this is a visualization of his current workflow. So he's doing like pre-processing with co-reference resolution, for example, and then he has his automated extraction of the triples. And then he's doing some clustering. So this is an example of the clustering that he's been doing on the predicates. So this is this is really, really experimental work that I'm showing you. And Jaget is basically, he's kind of like doing a proof of concept at this point. But like the part of this work is that we ask ourselves, like, this is really interesting. What are we going to be able to do with this? How are we going to make, meaning out of this? And so what we're kind of coming to understand more and more is that this ability to be able to extract and to understand the patterns in triples, it looks like they're suggesting to us the kinds of memories that are being recalled in these interviews. So just here, very kind of provisionally, it seems that in the interviews, people, so these are often like humanities scholars from the 1950s, they were calling things about the evaluative decisions that they had to make about the technologies that they were working with, which was, I think, a very unusual thing for humanist people to be thinking about in the 1950s. And in their recollections of the interviews, they were remembering this as much as the regular academic conferences they went to. So our sort of initial hope and what we think is happening is that, just a closer look of the breakdown of the triples, is that this approach is going to give us what we're calling a kind of a bird's eye view of memories that are present and indeed absent in the oral history corpus. And this might not only enhance our understanding of the corpus itself, but in terms of like markers and patterns, the markers and type and patterns of recollections it contains. But it might be really interesting, and this is another ongoing part of the work, to then juxtapose the recollections that are found in the digital oral history, so in the oral history interviews, with the kinds of discourses that we find in, for example, archival materials or the humanist discussion group. And this may allow us to think about how the field has been remembered and narrated and institutionalized in different discursive and institutional and ego or group settings. So Jaget has been, in order to automate the extraction of the triples, he's been evaluating a range of zero-shot AI models, so from Llama, IBM, and Rebel families. And we're still unsure, so we're encountering issues again. We're encountering hallucination again. So the hallucination that we're encountering is where relationships are being suggested that are not present in the text, and they're very normative relationships, I have to say. We're finding, I guess, an overgeneralization. So in this example that we have here, so Judy Malloy mentions in her interview that she was educated at the University of California. The model infers educated at as, she talks about how she had access to the library, and then this is what we were given, this triple, which says that she was educated there, but she wasn't. This is an overgeneralization, and it seems that the model is defaulting to what's in training data, but there's nothing for it to tell us when it's unsure, which I think is a wider issue in any case. And then some bias and hallucination that I've already mentioned. So we're back to basically to the same issue again. This might be really transformative. The idea that we could take, minimum 50 interviews and we can like automate triples and we can have our clusters and we can do potentially really, really interesting and really fine kind of humanities analysis that I think we genuinely wouldn't be able to do otherwise. On the other hand, we're still figuring out, because Jaget is also trying to develop some automated methods so that we can get some sense of how pervasive this is. But we're back to the same issue of these problems occurring, but all of them to me is really quite plausible. We can sort of, again, we can compare and contrast the nature of the triple extraction with the original sentence and see how much they're diverting. But yeah, how much human intervention are we going to need here? what about, at what point is that going to make sense in the context of when we think about the environmental cost actually of these technologies? And yeah, and just what's the nature, so some of these hallucinations or overgeneralizations are quite, they're not, maybe not such a big deal, others we're not so sure of. So this work is all ongoing, and maybe I can come back in another year or two and present to you what I hope is a happy outcome. So to conclude then, so kind of generative AI, I know that an ASR is not technically generative AI, which is for simplicity, I'm putting everything onto this term. It can be understood as a multi-stage process involving extraction, decontextualization, abstraction, generalization, prediction, adaptation, deployment, and of course, commercialization. So generative AI relies on the extraction and often the radical decontextualization of complex situated information, transforming it into so-called data. The data is, I'm talking about the training of the models process now. So the data is then created into massive data sets, which are frequently unrepresentative of undervoiced communities, poorly documented, even if this has improved, or restricted by proprietary constraints. And then the data sets are used to train large general purpose models with the goal of achieving high accuracy in prediction tasks. And then once trained, there can be all manner of adaptation, reinforcement learning, and so on to send them off into specific domains. So as the literature notes, this process often leads to a kind of homogenization in which biases and limitations of the original models can be amplified. And in addition to the kinds of these kinds of issues that I've just mentioned, there's also, of course, material and infrastructural conditions that really decisively shape this technology. So generative AI requires massive computational resources, high-end GPUs operating in parallel, energy-intensive data centers, sophisticated cooling systems, vast models with billions of parameters, considerable labor involved often in data saturation. So, for example, the cost of training GPT-4, which was, I think, a huge disappointment in terms of the advances that it had made, has been estimated at being in excess of $100 million. So as Bamonsi et al. Have observed, for most of the history of computing, there's been a one-way march towards greater capability for lower cost and efficiency. The success of AI has inverted this curve. We've reached a point, to quote another paper, where, in a quote, decisions of global power, decisions of global significance are being made by 5 US-based tech CEOs, and where their power is enabled by and continues to depend on the extraction and exploitation of the resources and labor of everybody else. For example, in everyone's data that's screwed up and enough is taken. So in this light, I think it's clear that generative AI is really driven by a fundamentally different logic to that of the oral history that I've been, of course, in a somewhat idealized way presenting to you. And so it's developed in institutions and in research environments where oral historians and humanists can't always be present and can't contribute in a kind of a fundamental way. So I suggest then that where AI is often predictive, oral history is interpretive. Where AI is data-driven, oral history is context-driven. Where AI is disembodied, oral history is relational. Where AI replicates homogeneity, oral history seeks diversity. So against this horizon, I think the deep complexity of our take-up of these technologies really sort of coming to view. But that said, obviously I don't want to be some sort of like a doom monger, because obviously there is also like amazing opportunity. So it's about somehow finding this balance. And my contention is that one of the really important ways of trying, and intellectually, obviously we need a whole lot of technical steps, but like intellectually, one of the very important things for digital oral history, but also digital humanities, digital history as a field to do as we move forward, is to return to our kinds of epistemological tenets, and then to reflect on how they're positioned, repositioned by, for example, so let's say algorithmic processes. Even in the case where this process is delivering something that's very useful, it may be the case that still it won't always be appropriate in order to use it. Okay, so thank you for your attention.